But if you don't imagine a better future and you just continue to go back to the past, then you will just be haunted. We're playing around in a graveyard. You're digging up bodies. This is zombified capitalism at this point.
Welcome back to The Tea with me, Myriam Francois. Before we dive in, make sure to hit subscribe so you never miss an episode of The Tea. If you want to support the show and help shape future episodes, join our Patreon community. Think of it as the resistance. Plus, if you're in our top tier, you'll get access to ad-free episodes. The link's in our bio. Britain is deep in political turmoil. In July 2024, the Labour Party won a landslide victory, but it's since overseen savage welfare cuts on the elderly and disabled and painful tax hikes. Labour today commands less than 20% support in opinion polls, and that's before the announcement of the budget, which is predicted to anger many, as Labour tries to fill a £20 billion spending gap after 14 years of Conservative rule. Amidst this, the American Elon Musk is claiming the UK is being flooded by Muslim hordes threatening our culture, a message eagerly echoed by his UK supporters. Meanwhile, Reform UK, a party that claims to represent the silenced working class, but is led by a millionaire pushing tax cuts for the rich, now tops the polls ahead of Labour. Headlines obsess over immigration and cultural identity, drowning out the everyday struggles faced by most people: the soaring cost of living, a housing crisis, and an overstretched NHS. Meanwhile, inequality is at levels unseen since Dickensian Britain. 70% of those in poverty live in working households. The richest 10% control 57% of the UK's wealth, while the bottom half share less than 5%. Millions of households spend more on essentials each month than they earn, pushing them into growing debt and hardship. And regional wealth inequality has nearly doubled over the last decade, deepening the north-south divide. With all this in mind, why is a party focused on blaming the poor rather than the rich gaining ground? Why do mainstream parties echo far-right rhetoric? What impact does the rise of the far-right have on women, and how is this linked to growing anti-intellectualism? Where to from here? To unpack this all, I'm joined by Louisa Munch, an academic from Rochdale, one of Britain's most deprived northern towns, whose viral TikToks unpack politics, the far-right, culture, and everything in between. Louisa, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Thanks for being with us. You close all of your videos with an iconic line: "Remember, we can't have a democracy without informed citizens. It's an emergency." What's the emergency, Louisa?
To be quite frank, we are at a very high risk of falling into fascism. And I do believe that we need to be careful with terms like fascism. But when we see it, we also need to be able to identify it, and we need to be able to name it. And I think that truly is the emergency, is that we're sliding into something that we've seen before. We're being faced with these ghosts of the past. Nigel Farage does not belong in, our era. It does not belong in our century. He belongs somewhere in the 1930s, I think. And, I teach at a university. It feels that I am teaching in the 1930s, that we're on a precipice. I know Noam Chomsky talks about this a lot. It's a really good book, The Precipice, if you're interested. But we're very much on the edge of something. And I think everybody can feel it. There's a real sense in society that something has gone awry, something has gone wrong, but nobody can quite put it into words, or nobody can quite capture exactly what it is that people are feeling. And I think that's kind of what I'm trying to do with my social media, is give people a language and give people an empowerment to unpack this feeling and this sense. And it's a zeitgeist, I guess. I think Hegel calls it a zeitgeist. And zeitgeist means spirit and ghost. And that's exactly how it feels. It's like this overwhelming, ghostly spirit of society of our age. I always think of it in terms of, a relationship. If you feel a certain way and you are unable to unpack how you feel, if you're unable to be pragmatic and put those feelings into words, then you're probably going to end up sabotaging, your relationship. And I think social relationships are really what it comes down to here, and are really at the forefront of our politics. and there is so much anger. And I think that's what I'm desperately trying to do, is unpack that anger, unpack that feeling, and make things clearer for people, because people feel like there is no clarity. There is no concrete truth anymore. And I think it is really, really difficult for people, and I want to give voices to people as well.
Well, you're from Rochdale, which, as we said in the introduction, is one of the most deprived towns in the UK. It's also in the headlines for a variety of reasons, which we will touch on. But, Reform UK would say that they speak for women just like you, white working class, communities.
Yeah.
Reform is the natural, voting choice, is it not?
Well, it's interesting. People do want reform. I want reform, but it means something completely different. It always reminds me of George Orwell, 1984, when we get to a certain point where everything means the opposite. We have the Ministry of Truth, and it's actually just creates lies. We have the Ministry of Love, and it's actually this place of torture. And I think we've moved into this nihilistic age where people have lost even the value of values. People have no belief in anything anymore. So anything can mean anything. It's all this politics of emotion. And, I did my PhD on nostalgia, because nostalgia is a feeling. Everybody has been nostalgic for something. I find it so interesting. And I could see this pervasive nostalgia back home. And nostalgia is ultimately about a loss, isn't it? It's a lost object. And you have created this lost object. Your relation to this lost object now is through the bittersweetness. Yeah. So it's sweet because, the object you've lost, there is still love there for it. But the bitterness is the fact that you will never, ever get it back. And that bitterness is what we are seeing really exploited in reforms policy. The sweetness is obviously, let's go back to this age, let's go back to this lost object, of the past, where it was better, where things were clearer, where you felt empowered. But the bitterness is this undercurrent of racism and revenge and misogyny, and what that truly is being used for. And I think nostalgia is not inherently bad. It's unifying, it's a universal feeling. And it really brings people together. It's about community. It's a shared collective memory. But that can so easily be weaponized. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing. And particularly in Rochdale, it's interesting because it's a place that has lost a lot. And it's funny because we have all these cotton mills, these big sort of relics of where capitalism began. Marx and Engels were in Manchester. Engels has a nice statue. And it's like capitalism began here. The hope began here. And then it took flight. And these cotton mills are now derelict. They're falling apart. They often set on fire. They're memories and reminders that we've lost a lot. We've lost hope. And I think that really is the sense of what reform are trying to use, is this loss of hope. Because when you don't have hope, then you'll turn to the past for revenge. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing.
But what do you think has genuinely been lost? Because I agree with you that something for sure has been lost. And that's what I'd like to get into. Because as you say, reform would say that what's being lost is your culture. What's being lost is your sense of identity because of all these people coming over, because they're changing the nature of Britain. So is that what's being lost?
I think what's been lost is community. It's, security. It's being able to get an NHS appointment. It's the freedom from worry. It's, the freedom from not worrying about how much your Aldi food shop is going to cost. That loss it's a material loss. It's a loss of home. I mean, nostalgia means nostos algia in Greek. It's the pain of homesickness, and that's exactly what we're talking about here. Is this loss of home, but also the loss of the future, the loss of being able to imagine a better future than the present. And I mean, I always blame it on neoliberalism, this sense that, as Margaret Thatcher said, there is no alternative. There is no outside. There's no other way. And, you know, we've seen neoliberalism fall. We've seen the end. Like, it died in 2008. And yet we are living in this zombie age of neoliberalism. It's dead, and yet it's still dragging us along in this death rattle to the end. And it's like exhausting. And there's sort of no wonder why people feel so hopeless, because when there are no alternative ideas around, people do feel like, well, let's go back to the past. Let's go back to these, you know, more clearer times where there is like stable identities. I think that's where misogyny comes in and things like this. Like traditional values get drawn upon in these times of like uncertainty. But if you don't imagine a better future and you just continue to go back to the past, then you will just be haunted. You know, we're playing around in a graveyard, you're digging up bodies. This is zombified capitalism at this point. That's really, I think the problem is the lack of imagination that we have of the future. Even when you argue with people about, you know, oh, well, socialism is ridiculous or something, and it's like, what is it about socialism that's ridiculous where capitalism is any better? Or it's that lack of just asking the fundamental questions of what we really want about, you know, towards the future.
And you've said this before, that, you know, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is capitalism, right?
Yeah.
Which I think is a quote. Why do you think that is? Why is it easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism? Or certainly another form of economic governance that might be better suited to the needs of the majority?
Well, that's actually a quote from Mark Fisher, who I love all his work. I highly recommend everybody read it. But this notion of you can find, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. I always think of the film WALL-E. You know, the planet has died, and yet capitalism has managed to survive in the spaceship. You know, look at what all the billionaires, tech billionaires, are trying to do now. They've given up on the planet. They want to take capitalism elsewhere. Let's build a rocket ship. Let's go and live on Mars or whatever. And it's strange the way that capitalism gets inside us. And, you know, we've written about this for centuries. Like, I always think about hubris, this like Faustian idea of like greed and this disease that infects you of like, it becomes, it's not just, capitalism doesn't just live outside us, it lives within us now. We live in an achievement society. And I think that's really key. Like Thatcher said, economics is the method, but the real goal was to change the heart and soul of the British people. And I think that's exactly what she's done. And that's why it's so difficult to imagine something different. Because changing people's heart and soul is very difficult. Once you've done it, it's very difficult to change it back. And what that really meant is that she changed us from being able to see ourselves as a community to the individual. You know, we are atomized little projects now, and it's all about being able to, you know, the sacred being in capitalism is the entrepreneur. Like, it's, you don't need the threat of discipline or the threat of the outside. This isn't 1984 when people are afraid, you know, to go against it. They will discipline themselves. Like, this is Brave New World. You know, people will take the Soma because you are doing it to yourself. And I think that's why we have, you know, mental health issues like burnout. Burnout is completely constructed within neoliberalism.
And what about this, right? You mentioned earlier the rise of misogyny in the context of sort of the rise of, you know, conservative / far right ideals. Like, what's the connection that you see there between the appeal of this nostalgia, this far right obsession with bringing back the past, and the resurgence, I guess, of, you know, this manosphere that's obsessed with traditional roles and, you know, red pills and all the rest of it?
Aside from sort of like the fundamental divide and conquer thing, I think this like rise of misogyny is about going back to some sort of like social order, this hierarchy that we can rely on. It runs alongside this rise of Christian nationalism as well, this let's return to something that feels stable. Traditional gender roles feel stable. I know my place within society. When so many people feel uprooted, they don't know the place within society, especially the white working class. You know, their job would have given them stability back pre-Thatcher, you know, they had the security of their position, and that no longer exists. And when you feel that you're being dethroned, that your power is like waning in society, then to oppress somebody else feels good. It feels like a win. And also when you have created such a competitive environment, you know, we live in a market society. It's all about winners. You can win, that the belief that you can win. Any little win that you can gain, any little win that you can glean will make you feel better, because ultimately you're just being lumped into a group of losers. You know, what happens at the end of Monopoly? It ends because one person steals the whole board, takes the whole board. So we do live in this monopolized, you know, ultra competitive neoliberal capitalism. And when it just creates losers, ultimately, even the winners are losers. And it's not enough for Elon Musk to simply be a trillionaire. He has to get into the White House. He has to build a rocket ship. It clearly is not that satisfying. And I feel like we need to think of better ways to satisfy not only ourselves, but our social, you know, sphere.
Well, speaking of Elon Musk, he has been very active in commenting on politics here in the UK. In fact, he made 51 posts about grooming gangs in January alone. And of course, very sadly, your town, Rochdale, is associated with one of the biggest scandals, surely, of our generation, the grooming gang scandals, which has been seized upon, of course, by Reform as their sort of calling card, you know, that they're out here to defend these working class communities, working class white girls who they claim were being preyed on, and sort of want to put a racial lens on the abuse that these girls suffered. Let me ask you a little bit about the public perception of Rochdale, you know, via the media, via X, versus the town that you've grown up in.
It's interesting because obviously I've lived all my life there. I still live there. So it wasn't until I left that I realised that there was this sense of like depravity, because I actually like Rochdale. I think it's quite nice. But when I went to university, I went to Liverpool, and this was back in 2017. And this programme called Three Girls had just aired on, I think it was BBC at the time, about the Rochdale grooming gangs. And I was very aware of it growing up because my mum, she actually worked in social services. The misconception, I think, with the grooming gang scandal is that people seem to believe that nothing was done for these girls because the police were afraid of being called racist. And that is fabricated, because my mum works incredibly hard to try and get justice for these girls, but these girls were called prostitutes. These girls were completely dismissed by the system, and we don't have to scratch the surface of the police that deep to realise that this misogyny is so systemic, you know, and how rape is treated as well through the police. And if we're going to talk about misogyny, then we need to talk about systemic misogyny. You know, they are not protesting on the streets because of Prince Andrew. They're protesting because of the ethnic minorities that have done these crimes, and we need to treat them the same. And I think that's really important.
It's very much been depicted as this idea that the police were afraid of being called racist. And that is typically represented as part of a wider picture of a community that's highly divided, that there are deep tensions between the communities, that there's no integration, that people don't speak literally the same language. I mean, you know, is that a fair assessment of the Rochdale you know?
No, I don't feel that. I mean, we have a very diverse population in Rochdale, and I've grown up there. I haven't really known any different. Like, my dad is Danish. It wasn't until 2015, 2016, I was 15, 16 at the time, so I wasn't old enough to vote, but Brexit changed everything. This stoking and fanning the flames of racism changed everything. All of a sudden, your neighbour is your enemy. And I didn't understand it at the time. I felt very much on like the periphery because I was British enough, but I was also European, so it was a very strange time to sort of navigate. And that's why I decided to do my PhD, because I realized that this is only getting worse, this division. And I couldn't, like we were saying at the very start, like I couldn't put this into words. I couldn't put this pervasive feeling of threat into words. And that's what it is. People feel threatened, and they should feel threatened. We are losing our NHS. We're losing our ability to access safe housing. We're losing the ability to have control over our lives. And that sense of loss is being manipulated by people like Nigel Farage. I think Nigel Farage is just a bit of a betting man, He'll place his bets where he feels like the zeitgeist is going, and he can see that these people don't have a language, they don't have a way of seeing, of putting these emotions into sort of a political idea or, organising. So to give these people a face and a race to blame it on seems like an appealing idea.
So are you saying there aren't really tensions and that they are just scapegoating, Muslims and Asian communities, or are they capitalizing on something that's there but that you're saying isn't kind of the real root of the issue? If you're enjoying the show, why not join our Patreon community? The Tea is more than a YouTube show. It's a space to foster meaningful change together. By becoming a member, you're supporting that mission. And if you join our top tier, you'll get exclusive ad-free episodes too. So join us now, link in our bio.
Obviously, there are tensions, but this racism that we're seeing, it's a fantasy. Like, I think of my nana, right? So my nana voted for Brexit. She voted for UKIP, and she probably won't see this, so it's fine. But she will speak very kindly about the Asian girl that she knows at Morrison's. What she is being given as a scapegoat is a place where she can put those feelings of oppression, of repression. She's being given something to fuel this feeling of unfreedom and this feeling of loss. And I think that's why I'm trying to do what I'm doing, because yes, we feel repressed. Yes, you have something to be angry about, but it's not people of colour or women. It's about the system. And the problem is this system, Adam Smith called it the invisible hand. It's invisible. That's the point. So when you're given a face and a race, then it makes it incredibly easy to sort of say, oh, okay, well, that's an easy answer. I don't have to do all this critical thinking. I don't have to jump through these loops to get. And I think that's why, I think there's so much power in education. There's so much power in critical thinking, because it gives you the sense that, oh, I can understand this, and I can move beyond this like easy scapegoat sort of like exit route to my feelings of unfreedom.
So it seemed to me that the way these girls were treated smacked of classism, that these girls were viewed as trash. The terminology that we used to refer to them was that somehow they were worthless. And that speaks to my understanding of a wider perception of working class communities in this country. And that part of the equation seems to be completely missing from the conversation, as does this assumption that, working class communities are just a little bit racist. They're just, if you just point and stare at the Asian people at the back, then working class communities will be easily led on.
Take the bait.
But it doesn't make sense to me when I look at the demographics of those very communities, which are the most integrated, the most intermixed, the most likely to be living side by side with people of different backgrounds and religions. So Do you think that class is a factor in not only the way that these young girls were treated, but also in kind of the weaponization of that discourse by a party that claims to speak for the white working class?
Yeah, definitely. It is always about classism, I think, a lot of the time. I mean, Marx would probably agree. And this isn't just an economic class divide. This is an educational class divide, and it's a cultural class divide. It is all about this ability to name the oppression, name the thing. And if you're not given that language, then it's very difficult. I mean, people like Nigel Farage because he seems to speak to them. He speaks their language. And I think the working class feel, and I felt this, you know, these academic elites or the political elites aren't speaking to us. They don't sound like me. They don't sound like us. They don't have the same social coding, because we live in a society where they've made academia or they've made education incredibly inaccessible for people that aren't part of the economic elite as well. So it's this reproduction of ideas at the top and the manipulation of the bottom. And I think if we don't tackle that, then it is a game for the elites. I don't know if you saw it. Gary Stevenson was on The Rest is Politics, and Rory Stewart said to him that his class anger wasn't allowing him to see the realities of politics. And I thought it was so interesting, because what is politics? What is politics if not class anger? You know, if it's not about change, is it a hobby? Is it something, is it managerial? Is it bureaucratic? And I find it so sort of interesting that this dismissal of the way that the working class feel, and this passion and this, you know, is seen as like, oh, well, we can't control that, we can't, and then it will get fueled towards the migrants, or because ultimately the working class, or the, you know, the middle classes, that's the 99%. Like, they have their strength in numbers. That 1% would lose in a fight, especially if you're a northerner. Yeah. To get theoretical about, you know, I do theory. It's the death drive. And we see this, I did a video about, we can see this in football. The elites have always, and capitalism has always given you a space to release this repression, this desire to be free, you know. And I mean, we can go to football games, you can get really angry at the players, and you can, you know, get aggressive and you shout or whatever. And then you can also fuel that towards scapegoats, you know, because this repressive nature of capitalism, that repression doesn't just go away. It is pervasive. It will sit within the person. If you've ever seen Fight Club, you know, he has this boring job or whatever, and he feels like you can't quite name the oppression, but it's always there. So he goes and starts, you know, punching people in a basement and things like that. So I think it's like channeling the energy, channeling the oppression towards a group of people.
And you mentioned education there, and just briefly, because obviously you work in academia, and there have been quite significant changes to the way that education operates within this country. And there'll be people watching this from abroad where it's very normal to pay huge amounts of money and get in debt to get an education. Give us a sense of how education has changed in maybe the last few decades, and the impact that you're seeing on the new generation of citizens that you're educating.
Academia and education has been so financialized. It's been neoliberalized. So basically my students, they care so much about that grade. They care so much about that number. And education is not about that. It's been made into a personal investment. And you can see why, because if you are saddled with this debt, that is a personal debt. You know, you are the only person that's going to sit with that debt. And if you turn education into this personal investment, then it takes it away from the fact that it's a public good. You know, it is absolutely necessary. Like I always say, we can't have a democracy without informed citizens. You have to be able to give people a language to name the oppression and to see beyond, you know, simply the information that you're given. You know, we talk about it's been in the news recently about like news bias and the BBC, and we don't want unbiased news. There's no such thing as unbiased information. It's all shot through a certain lens. But what you need to do is understand the bias. If you are given the information and you can understand the bias, you've got two lots of information there. It gives you double the information. And I think that's what critical thinking, gives you. And higher education is one of the very few spaces left where it is a sphere that allows you to cultivate this critical thinking. I feel very safe, and I think a lot of academics do feel safe within that space of academia. We can challenge people's views and it not feel like the stakes are so high, because it's about production of ideas. It's about creation. It feels like liberation. Education, I'll always say, is a practice of freedom. And I think what capitalism has done to education is really take away that power.
Well, interestingly, you open a lot of your videos saying, that you're doing a critical theory PhD and you don't think others should pay £100,000 to understand the world, which is great. So you provide some of that education for free online. One of the findings from the reform reports is that only about 1 in 5 reform supporters has a degree, compared with roughly 42% of UK adults. In a sense, a degree can open unimaginable doors, but we keep being told that, not everyone needs a degree. But, you can go into an apprenticeship, you can go straight into work, that, it's a bit of a waste of money for a lot of people to get a degree. What would you say to that?
It shouldn't first cost a lot of money, but it's absolutely not a waste. It is never a waste. It's about cultivating a democracy. If you don't have an educated population, and then, you put a paywall up and you say, look, only the people with a lot of money or a lot of time or with a financially stable home can access education, then you end up with a cultural elite, or you end up with an academic elite. And essentially, when you say, right, okay, let's all vote on this, it's like saying, okay, well, within a jury, only 10% of you have the information, have the case before you. And that's a real issue for democracy. This isn't about getting a job. Like, obviously, this is essential, but it should be free. It's a human right to be educated. It's about liberation. It's about freedom. And it's about being able to name oppression. And I think that's what we're seeing, is the lack of clarity that people have in naming the world and naming the problems is where this confusion becomes rage. And if we don't tackle that, then we will end up in a far worse situation. And that's why I always say it's an emergency.
Well, speaking of naming things, if you follow legacy media's lead, you'd think reform voters only care about immigration and kicking out asylum seekers. But there was recently the largest survey of reform voters, and it was really, really interesting because the picture that came out was much more complicated, I think, than what most people assume. Sure, immigration matters, but so do the cost of living pressures, local issues and everyday concerns. Economic insecurity clearly was the big one. What were some of the major points of that survey that stood out to you in terms of the perception we have of reform and reform voters versus the reality?
One of the most interesting parts was, obviously, they have a very large white working class. That's what the article called them. Their biggest issue was the cost of living crisis, not immigration, which I thought that was really interesting because, like you said, the perception is this is all about immigration. This is all about hating the other. But in reality, this is about material circumstances. This is about people's daily lives of being able to afford the food shop or being able to send the kid to a good school or university, and people are desperate for that. That is what that survey is saying. Like, the white working class want better conditions, and they're just being told that Nigel Farage will provide that. But the problem is, these feelings of loss and these feelings of, desire for change, they're not necessarily being, Zach Polanski is doing a great job of instilling this hope and create a counter narrative here. But we need to change the conversation from being about migration to being about wealth inequality, because I think people do understand that. And Nigel Farage is simply sort of going off and fueling this desire for better material conditions, but it's being shot through like an anti-immigrant. If we get rid of these people, then things will get better. And it's about like a fantasy of scarcity here. People think that we don't have enough social housing because there's not enough. Like there's not enough being built. But in reality, like there is enough housing. There's empty housing. The super rich are buying houses as stock. They don't even need to rent them out because assets are a flight from money, and when that obviously has a really bad impact on what the how money is valued, assets become more valuable. So we need to change the conversation from migration to wealth inequality if we're going to change the material circumstances of people.
Well, one of the other interesting findings I thought of that report was this idea that the majority of the voters are actually middle income. I don't know if you saw this, but basically they call them in the report the squeezed drivers. They make up 29% of Reform voters, and they're worried about the cost of living. They're uneasy about immigration, but they're not extreme, as it were, about those views. And a lot of them have switched from Conservative to Reform, and some even came over from Labour. Is it shocking to you that the majority of Reform voters are what we call middle income?
I think that really speaks to this idea of when it gets bad for the middle classes, like we are really in trouble, because if you're on middle income, then, I mean, historically, that's kind of a good place to be. But if the middle income people are struggling, then the wealth inequality is so bad. We need to do something about that. And Reform are giving, again, people a scapegoat. They're giving people a voice. They're saying, okay, well, we want reform, we want change. And also like an authenticity, a realness, really trying to make people feel heard. And when it's just doing the complete opposite. And this is the point about, we need to change the conversation from migration and scarcity to distribution. This isn't about we don't have enough. We do have enough. We have enough resources. It's just not being distributed properly. And I will always stand by the fact that the working class and middle class people do want socialism. They just don't know what that really means. Like it just asking fundamental questions like, do you think that we should all have access to healthcare? Obviously, yeah. Do you think we should all have a roof over our heads? Like this idea of like everything has to be a competition, I think it comes down to that like heart and soul argument again, that we've completely changed the way that we even see the world. Everything has to be, well, you deserve it and you don't deserve it. And we won't get anywhere if all we're doing is blaming each other. So
what do you make of the situation that we're in? Because technically, in July 2024, Britain did vote for socialism, right? Majority of people in this country voted for a Labour government. But then we haven't really had policies that people would think of as supporting the majority of people from a socialist perspective. And then we're seeing the rise of a party that is anti-socialist. So how do you make sense of that in relation to your claim that people want socialism?
I think it comes down to language. I think it comes down to naming the problems, naming exactly what it is, having being able to think critically about these things. I mean, socialism has been given a bad name. Like Donald Trump literally will say as an insult, like, oh, she's a Marxist or she's a socialist. And it's so mystified. And I think that is the problem. Like this mystification of the economy, the mystification of politics. Oh, we can't understand it. We can. We absolutely can understand it. And yes, it's difficult. And I think particularly for me, like, I work in academia now. I never in a million years thought that I would be in the position. I never thought I'd be able to teach at Warwick University because these people don't sound like me. They don't have the same social code as me. They don't, and I think it's, again, the way that we speak to people, the way that we use language, it does need to change, because people do feel underrepresented. And then you get Nigel Farage sat with a bloody Guinness in his hand at a pub, and they're like, oh, okay, that looks real. When in reality, it's the pulling the wool over your eyes. And I think critical thinking is that cut through of that wool. You know, it gives you a different perspective.
Speaking of terminology, you've used the term white working class, as have I, in this conversation. Do you question that term at all? Is there a white working class that you would make as distinct to the working class more broadly? Is referencing the white working class itself playing into this sort of racialized notion that the white working class have different interests to, you know, non-white working class people?
I think it's maybe about dethronement here. I mean, if you're not white, you know, you have experienced oppression, I assume, in most cases. And the same with women, minority groups, you experience this oppression. And the white working class, yes, you experience classism and things like that. But this privilege of whiteness, you now feel is waning. And especially white men. I mean, most of the base of Donald Trump is the white working class. You know, if you imagine the kind of Donald Trump supporter or the reform supporter in your head, they're going to probably be from a post-industrial town like me. You know, they'll have had a stable, secure job, and now they no longer have that. And I think it's that loss. It's been taken away from them. You know, minorities have always had to be vigilant. They've always had to sort of have a language to understand their own oppression. I think the white male base haven't always had that, you know. This is sort of the first time they're really experiencing oppression, other than classism, you know. But that dethronement is very sort of dangerous, because Wendy Brown, one of my favourite theorists, she talks about this, you know, when you have been used to sort of being above other people or having somebody to sort of define yourself against, then equality feels like oppression to you. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing here with like the white male base and the anger of the white male base. And again, I think their feelings are completely valid. You know, they have lost a lot, but it's about making that feeling, you know, a political, organised reality.
And those same people actually support a wealth tax on the rich. So we see that the study that we were just discussing about reform voters shows that 61% of them back a one-off tax on households worth over £10 million. But the Reform Party itself doesn't back a tax on the wealthy. So again, how do you make sense of these inconsistencies where it's like working class communities that have been absolutely economically neglected, socially neglected, turning to a millionaire who doesn't want to tax other millionaires, but hey, he'll drink a Guinness in a pub?
Yeah. It's that realness, isn't it? It's that authenticity. We feel like we've been spoken down to by elites, and now somebody is not afraid to say the racist thing or the misogynistic thing or call someone woke. For some reason, that feels real to people. That feels like truth. And I think it's a strange conflation where freedom is freedom to say the racist thing. You know, it's freedom from, and it's not freedom to. And that's where we need to change the conversation. It should be freedom to send your kids to any school, freedom to buy whatever you want in Aldi and not worry about the receipt. And instead, it's about protectionism. It's about nationalism. It's about exclusionary politics. It's about who's inside and who's outside of this group. And it's distraction at the end of the day. And it's also completely fabricated. They know exactly what they're doing. They want to create the spectacle of politics. We do live so much in this society of the spectacle now. Look at social media. It matters more what your relationship looks like on social media than what it actually is. And when you allow politics to fall into the spectacle, it becomes a theatre. It doesn't become real to people. And I think that is incredibly dangerous, because then you get people who say, I get a lot of comments on my videos. If I'm trying to explain what reform want to do to the NHS, they're like, we don't care, we just want reform. And it's like that lack of care and that lack of reality to the situation is speaking to this spectacle. They just want the spectacle of reform, of change. But in reality, it's material, and that's what we need to give people a language for.
So in the spectacle or in the theatres, you say, of politics, the best actors obviously come to the forefront. Let me ask you about whether you see the success of reform, including in Rochdale in the recent by-election there, as a product of reform. Actually, this is what their supporters would say. They're on the ground, they're listening to people, they're attentive to people's needs. Is it about something that reform is doing right, or is it more to do with what Labour might be doing wrong?
This nationalism that's happening, we've got these flags everywhere in Rochdale, like they're literally on the ground, like they're on the roundabouts and things like that. I was speaking to a colleague at Warwick about it, and he was saying, we've done this for hundreds of years. They used to put heads on sticks. This is about a threat. This is about what you are being threatened, and the feeling is there. The feeling is correct. Like, you are being threatened. And the last round of fascism came out of a First World War. It came out of a war, and people had something to blame it on. Like, they could see what had happened. People had lost everything. People had lost hope. People had lost limbs. We now live in an age where this violence has been slow. It has been taken away of your ability to get a NHS appointment or see a dentist. It feels really sort of implicit, rather than something you can put your finger on and say, this is who I need to blame. And when that happens and you don't have a clear enemy, then you are able to channel that energy and pick up that sort of anger and resentment and just put it somewhere else. And I think that's what nationalism does. We're in a sort of like disaster nationalism. I think Richard Seymour has a really good book on this. We do feel like the walls are closing in, like we're running out of time. We're in a climate emergency. Like, things are getting worse. And all we can think about is, well, these people, there's only going to be so many lifeboats. So the best thing you can do is perform your gender or perform your role, or, this performance. And I do think, there is a problem with the left in terms of Labour haven't been there to really do the reform that people want. They do want socialist policies. They do want these things. And they haven't done that. So we've got Zach Polanski now. I think he's doing a great job. But we do need to change people's minds about what the problem is.
Well, speaking of the problem, a recent Reform poll found that Reform voters could be tempted back to Labour at the next election. More than half said they'd be more likely to vote Labour if the government actually got NHS waiting lists down, which is what you alluded to, and probably funded it. 75% said they want help with the cost of living crisis. We've just had Nigel Farage say he's going to backtrack on Reform UK's promise to cut £90 billion worth of taxes. And among the reasons he's used to justify that is he's basically saying that if you put a tax on higher earners, and we keep hearing this mantra, right? If you tax the millionaires, there'll be an exodus. Should we be concerned that, if we tax the rich, they're all going to leave?
No, let them leave. Let them go. They can't literally take their business with them, for one. But also we need an exit tax. If you're going to leave, at least, pay the tax when you leave. But if we drain this wealth that is being hoarded by the super rich, then eventually, it will start to bring prices down on assets that we rely on. Like, this is the issue. These assets that are fundamental to our survival, like housing, is being used as stock. The super rich are like blood clots within the body. They will starve the working class if their wealth is not in some way redistributed. And, tax does that democratically. Tax is where we say, right, okay, this is where we can distribute this wealth to help the public. And what is the point of a state if you don't have that? And it's not about like capping people's, ability to succeed. It's just saying, okay, so we don't want these nurses going to food banks in the same country that people have like multiple yachts. I think it's absurd. Like, it's obscene.
Well, they'll obviously say, well, if you tax the multimillionaires, they will leave with their businesses, even if you put, some kind of exit tax on them. That will lead to a loss of jobs. It will affect the economy even further. We're often told this as a way of sort of keeping the City of London, for example, the banking cities, sort of free of regulation, that, if we put too much regulation, they'll just go elsewhere. We live in a global world where people can just move around, capitalist, fluid. What do you say to that? How does the UK remain competitive and attractive to investment if millionaires feel like it's somewhere that's hostile to them?
Well, it's not a free market, it's not. It's being completely controlled by the already super rich. Like, this idea that you can win the game. Again, it comes down to monopoly. There's not going to be a winner because ultimately one person will end the game. And we're already at the end stages of the monopoly game. You can't compete with the super rich. And yes, we need investment, but we need wealth redistribution. And people seem to have this idea like, obviously the UK government, the state is in so much debt. To who? Nobody asks these fundamental questions to these investors, to these people who've made money out of crisis when they could have, like during COVID, like this huge movement of wealth from the working class to the super rich. I mean, Naomi Klein talks about in The Shock Doctrine, these crises that neoliberalism relies on just create the perfect catalyst for money to be moved into the pockets of the super rich. And if we don't do something about that, we do need more regulations. And I think simply saying, well, millionaires need to invest more in the UK is again playing on this idea of scarcity. Like, oh, there's not enough. There is enough. Like, it just needs redistributing in a fairer way.
Now, I was going to ask you about the concurrent rise that we're observing of the sort of Christian evangelical trend that, I very much in the beginning was seeing as a US import, and I didn't think it would pick up much traction. But I don't know if you saw this viral video. There's an evangelical Christian group that was marching through Soho in full, almost like army style gear. They call themselves the King's Army. I'm also observing that we saw Nigel Farage say that it's utterly ludicrous and totally out of date to allow abortion up to 24 weeks. Of course, we've already discussed kind of the growing appeal of sort of neo-traditional visions of gender roles. Do you think that we are seeing a genuine shift towards Christianity, as part of this nostalgia for who we once were, this Christian nation? Or is there something else going on here?
I really like this question because Nietzsche writes exactly about this, disenchantment. He talks about, God is dead. Man killed God. And we're seeing this disenchantment again. Disenchantment is loss of truth, loss of trust in a system. And what happened after that? Well, people use that disenchantment to fuel fascism. And now it's kind of come full circle. We replaced God with man, and then now we've replaced man with the markets. And this distrust for politics, this distrust for our institutions, the distrust in intellectualism, in education, that there is no objective truth, that we must go back to something that says, okay, this is the social hierarchy. This is somehow concrete. This feels stable, I think is exactly what this Christian nationalism is speaking to. And I'm not anti-religious. I'm a Catholic, actually. So I do think that, people turn to religion a lot of times in times of desperation, in times of loss of hope. And I think, that probably speaks to it as well.
It's very interesting that all of these things seem to be happening at the same time, and that they're being instrumentalized as part of this vision of a return to some kind of glorious past. And I was going to ask you a little bit about sort of the nihilism that we also kind of see in this culture. I suppose that, you could argue that it's part of a response to the sense that nothing's working, the end is nigh, what's the point of anything, right? And so we've seen the rise of what's called recession pop, so the stratospheric success of Charlie XCX's Brat album, which The Guardian called the sound of nihilism and wayward dominance. Do you think that there is a pushback in culture right now against this sort of nihilism? Because it feels to me like there's almost a split. There's the people going down the I don't want to hear it, it's all so terrible, I just want to lose myself in the music. And then there's the other side of social media that is if it doesn't have a political message, I don't want to hear it.
Nihilism is really interesting. Gen Z, obviously I'm a part of Gen Z, is the most apparently depressed, anxious generation ever. And aside from, the fact that people say it's about social media and all these pressures, I think it's, again, the loss of the future. We don't see a way out of this a lot of the time. I think Charlie XCX speaks to this party at the end of the world sort of thing, and that's what Nietzsche is writing about. He says there's a freedom in nihilism because it means, you're absolved of guilt, you're absolved of everything. If God is dead, there's no one to judge you. We're free to do whatever we want. And also I think that speaks to a lot of, the language of Donald Trump, I can shoot someone in Central Park or whatever he said and get away with it. There is this freedom of guilt, this freedom of whatever you want to do. And I think with nihilism, Freud says you can't just talk your way out of it. If you're given all the information to somebody who is depressed, nihilistic, it doesn't make a difference. You can tell them, look, this person has died, you have to move on. It doesn't make a difference. We know that. You have to replace one feeling with another. You have to do that. So we need to replace that feeling with hope. We need to reinstill the hope in the future. And I was speaking to a colleague at Warwick who grew up in a dictatorship, and he said this is a very, very narrow window of time that we really have left to change this. And this disaster nationalism, this disaster fascism that we're seeing, it's right, okay, so it's going to be the end of the world or whatever. Let's just argue who gets the final seat. Let's just argue who gets to be, Nietzsche's, it's called the last man. There has to be a last man who doesn't care about anything, that's going to be there at the very end. All value has lost value, and it's getting very depressing, but that is what we're seeing. It's this competition for the heroic death, to be the final master. And I think if we don't replace and really steer another way out of this nihilism and think, right, okay, we can imagine a better future. Let's just ask these fundamental questions about what we want for our children and what we want for ourselves. And I think that's what it's about. And one of my favourite theorists, Hannah Arendt, talks about this idea of loving the world. You have to have a commitment towards the future. That is what politics is about. Politics is always a commitment to the future. The only time it's not is when it's the politics of revenge, and that is fascism. So I think we need to steer it away, and that means having conversations, having dialogue, unpacking these feelings and giving these feelings space, like therapy, but also saying, right, okay, where do we go now?
And where do the rise of conspiracy theories fit into your assessment of where we're at?
I think conspiracy theories are so interesting because it's sort of the cynical, critical theory, I guess. Conspiracy theory speaks to the desire to know. It really, really speaks to this desire to understand the world, name the world. But instead, and the fact is, you do have to jump through a lot of hoops to get to the conspiracy theory. It feels like you've done the intellectual labor to get there, but they're always a overarching theory of everything, aren't they? Oh, this, and this are happening. It's this person, it's this group. And the conspiracy theory, it allows for that feeling of empowerment. You feel empowered for knowing the truth or whatever. But in reality, there is no actual critical thinking there. And, critical thinking, it's really hard. It takes time. It's something that has to be taught. You can't just read a book and know how to think critically. And we are moving into this age of anti-intellectualism, of distrust of, of education, a distrust of facts, post-truth, they call it, fake news. And when we're not able to think critically about these things, then the conspiracy becomes that steps in to take its place. And I think that's really dangerous.
Given everything we've discussed today at the critical juncture that we find ourselves in, the sort of lack of imagination, the sense of hopelessness, of nihilism, the need for critical thinking, where are you deriving your hope from? And for people who are watching this, who want to be part of the resistance, who want to push back, what are you advising?
I have so much hope because I've only been doing this 4 months. This is really strange and overwhelming. But what is so crazy to me is the fact that in 4 months, I'm about to have 100,000 followers on Instagram. That's 100,000 people that want to know theory, that want to be able to feel empowered in knowledge, and that message me every day saying that this has given me a language to say to my nan, it's not patriotism, it's nationalism or something like that. And that gives me so much hope that, I've written a PhD on critical theory. Critical theory sounds depressing. We just critique things all day. But these writers have been here before. These writers have seen this rise of nationalism, of fascism before, and they've left these works to say, this is what we do, and this is the signs. And it gives me so much hope that, I don't want to see them die in vain or whatever. I think there's so much power in the public, in our imaginations. And in theory, we call it eros, we call it love, It's literally the love of the social. And we are social creatures. We deserve to live in a socialist society. We deserve to, we need each other. And I think that's what I've seen in terms of my social media. We're seeing this growth in, the Green Party members and these conversations. And my advice to people is always just speak to your family, speak to your friends, have a dialogue, be so compassionate. It's hard. It's so hard to, hear somebody who is so filled with rage and hatred and wants to blame migrants or whatever. It's so hard to hear that. But you really, really need to be so strong and courageous in being able to unpack those feelings and validate those feelings, but also give them a language to talk about what the issue is and talk about the wealth inequality and what they've lost. And I think that's really what we need to be doing, is having conversations, because, I think culture and our public imaginations can really change everything.
Louisa, thank you so much for talking to me today.
Thank you so much.
If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to subscribe and share it with your friends and loved ones. Follow us on Instagram and TikTok to stay tuned. And have you joined our Patreon yet? You'll get ad-free episodes, bonus content, and a voice in stories we will explore next. Your backing keeps the tea independent and fearless. So join us today. Keep questioning, keep daring, and keep resisting. Thanks for tuning into The Tea. If this episode resonated with you, drop a comment and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And why not dive into these other episodes we think you'll love? Let's keep the conversation going.